Okay, so you're thinking about doing a 40-day fast. Well, you were called to do this by some religious figure, or you wanted to do it for weight loss reasons, for social reasons, for health reasons. For whatever reason, you want to take on this path. My name is Tom, and this is the 40-Day Fast Manifesto. So for the first part of this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I did for my fast. It's currently 2 days after finishing my 40-day fast, which I started back in September. It is now early November. And I have a lot to say. I have a lot to say on the matter. So for the first part of this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is that you should do to go prepare for something like this, and some things to expect along the way. First off, some benefits. I could say right now, after having just completed this fast, that my self-control is an all-time high. I've lost since 40 pounds, started about 199 pounds. I'm currently weighing in at about 159. I probably put a couple pounds back on just from some of the foods I've been eating recently as yesterday and today. But we'll get to that and talk about that in a second. But self-control is all-time high, focus is all-time high. My sense of purpose is now at an all-time high. It's one of the most unique experiences of my life, I have to say, having gone through it. And when I tell people, they still can't believe that it's something I've gone through on my own. But I'll give you some of the nuts and bolts about what it's all about, how to prepare for something like this, and what you can expect. First off, in terms of things that you can do to prepare for your 40-day fast, is first and foremost, talk to a medical provider. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a health professional. Some of the things I say here are going to be contrary to medicine as you know it. I'm not confident enough in my studies of biology and neuroscience and chemistry, and I don't have any degrees in medical school or the residency, nor any years of practice, nor do I intend to. Go check with your doctor. Just call up your doctor. They're going to say something along the lines of, I recommend you don't do this, and you can take that information as you will. But if you plan on going through with this, definitely talk with them first so they give you a sense of what sort of things you should expect and how you can prepare for something like this. So here's what I did to go prepare for this. For starters, water. You're going to be drinking a lot of water during this time period, and you're going to be consuming a lot of electrolytes during this time period as well. That includes fasting salts, that includes literally just Himalayan salts. Some people like to take table salt and mix it with water. Some people will go out and they'll go purchase fasting salts. They'll go purchase different electrolyte solutions. Just so long as there's 0 calories in it, you're going to be completely fine with just that. The reason why you need to do that is because your body is running on electricity ultimately, and you get a large source of your electrolytes from your diet. So without electrolytes, basically you run the risk of something called heart failure. I think that's what they call that. If your body does not have enough electrolytes, usually what that kind of feels like is your skin starts drying out, and then all of a sudden you start feeling massive fatigues, massive confusion. If your electrolytes are getting pretty low, you're going to want to consume a good amount of electrolytes. Definitely ask your doctor about that as well. So making sure you're drinking water, making sure you're consuming electrolytes. So this is something that I haven't heard way too much of on the internet. But one really big thing I found to be very, very useful is having either a spiritual, a religious, or a meditative type of practice. Because when you go off of food, you're going to have to go onto some other source of energy. It's in large part I did this in the first place. I could look back at religious figures who had gone through a cleanse that lasted 40 days, where for 40 days and 40 nights they didn't eat any food. So as a consequence of that, some great insight was revealed to them during that time period. Usually they do that before they start their ministry, or they come out with the 10 Commandments, or they come out of a massive flood that just clears off the entire planet. Take or leave it on the different stories. But what I can tell you for sure is that it does exist as a cleansing period by which some pieces of information and insight is revealed to you. So what I would say is that definitely find some sort of practice that you could be utilizing during this time period. When I first started this, I started with the practice of trying to figure out what my purpose on this planet was. What is my purpose on this planet? Why was I put here by God, or by the universe, or by the earth, or by your ancestors? What is your reason for existence? I think this is a fantastic time to go and thoroughly and completely answer the question of, why am I here? And what am I going to do with my life in a way that justifies my existence here, that I can feel pretty damn good about. So finding some sort of practice, whether it's a religious practice, a spiritual practice, a meditative practice. And next, have definitely a meditative practice. That was something that was hugely helpful in this process. Some people like meditation, some people use it as an excuse to avoid productivity, some people hate meditation, some people use it as an excuse for whatever the reason is. Find a way of getting a meditation practice in. It could be as simple as closing your eyes for 5 minutes and just doing nothing else, but just closing your eyes for 5 minutes. People make meditation way too complex and too complicated. It could really be as simple as that. Just close your eyes for 5 minutes and don't do anything else. Something you should be aware of during the fasting process that showed up a lot for me was acid refluxes. Acid reflux is going to be a consequence of there being too much stomach acid in your body. When you stop eating food, when essentially the rules with the fast is you're just not eating food for 40 days straight. So what's going to happen, okay? So all of your digestive processes, they're going to say, okay, for a couple days, where's the food at? How come there's no food here? And everything that would otherwise be there to go digest that food is still working, but without the food, which means that you might have an increase in your stomach acid content. For me in particular, there's a condition called GERD in my family, gastroesophageal reflux, something along those lines, where essentially there's just acid reflux that come up. I don't think I have the condition yet, but I do have acid refluxes that come up. And that was something that did come up pretty frequently, especially as I was consuming a lot of the electrolytes. So for that, definitely ask your doctor about what to go do in those situations. What I did is probably something they wouldn't recommend. What I was doing as I was taking an antacid or two in order to go protect against this. The antacids were helping, reduce the acid reflexes. Also acid reducers like Impeccably, I think that's what it's called. Having something like that where you just pop one of those in every day just to reduce stomach acid, that's something that was pretty useful as well. So just work with your doctor on this. Say if you're starting to get acid reflux type of problems, make sure you're doing that. Another thing that was showing up is a dry mouth. Dry mouth is going to be a consequence of some combination of too much water or not enough water, and too much electrolytes or not enough electrolytes. So work it out. Work it out if that starts happening. Just listen to your body ultimately. And I would also recommend during this time to not just fast on food, but also to go and fast on other things. One of the first things I realized in this challenge is that we are drowning in dopamine. And for people that don't know what dopamine is, essentially that's the happy chemical that you feel when you have sugar, if you have coffee, if you see a loved one, if you see a funny video, anything that gives you that immediate boost of happiness. Not like a mood booster, but just like a happiness booster. Work on cutting those things out as well, particularly the cheap ones, the cheap pleasures. In this day and age, we are drowning in dopamine. We were built and we were evolved for more arid climates where, maybe we would get a piece of food every couple of weeks because they didn't have 3 meals a day back then. They had, eat when you could. And that's the tendency why people tend to go and overeat. So what I would encourage you to do is to cut out other things. What I did for this particular fast is I cut out food. I also cut out caffeine. Another thing I cut out was social media. Why did I pick these things? Because these are also things I was addicted to. Any other internet content, if you frequent many websites that you like to go on to. I say social media because that's the one where they've really figured out how to hack into the human algorithm to figure out how people respond to certain things, so you can keep hitting the button over and over again and you can keep feeling good. So overall, just to recap so far, make sure that you talk with your medical provider. Second, you're going to be drinking water and making sure you must have electrolytes. Third, to find a spiritual or religious practice to go stick onto, or a more meditative or purposeful practice. For this one, I was asking myself the question, what is my purpose here on this planet? So I could figure that out. And next, to go fasting off of, or rather to, next is to go be careful with acid refluxes and work with your medical provider on that in case things happen where you have acid reflux coming up. And fifth, fast everything else too. Get rid of other social medias. get rid of any sort of caffeine. If you're a smoker, get rid of nicotine. And what I encourage you to do is cut them out cold turkey right away. And I'm going to explain why with some of the realizations I had from this 40-day fast. So those are my recommendations for anyone that is looking to go take this on and get the type of result that I have right now, which really is weight loss, which is massive. Some of it at the cost of muscle loss, and that's just something you have to go build back up again. All-time high in terms of self-control, all-time high in terms of focus, all-time high in terms of relaxation, and in fact, I have zero addictions anymore. Anything will be called an addiction. I think people kind of use the word addiction very conservatively these days. Anyone that you see on the street that is looking down at their cell phone while crossing the street is an addict. Anyone that you see with their family or with their friends that are on their cell phones at one point or another are addicted to that piece of technology. It's supposed to be used as a tool, not as a way of distracting yourself or just getting your hit of dopamine. So I think a lot more people, I think the whole world is addicted, and the internet has really done a strong number to our brains for that matter. So what I would say is that when it comes to addictions, I would say I have zero of them right now. But let me get into the realizations. Okay, first realization is this, is that the internet really has destroyed the average human brain over the course of the last decade or so. And we can go into the maybe reasons why, but I think I would just ask you to take my word on this. I think that you know that your life is not quite where it could be right now simply because of what the internet has done to your brain. And this is a tragedy that this has happened to everyone on a massive scale. What happens when you have a society filled with addicts? Let's say we took something instead of the internet at anyone's access at any moment of time throughout the day, and we replace that with access to some drug. Maybe that drug is nicotine, or maybe that drug is cocaine, okay? So imagine what a whole society would look like if everyone was addicted to the same drug. Would it be the same person? I don't think so at all. I think that we give everyone a pass because, it's just something that's completely normalized. You could go on any article on the internet and find out all the reasons coffee is supposed to be good for you and how it helps you live longer, how it makes you smarter and protects against Alzheimer's. And while these things are all true, there was a time in human history where there were similar articles about cigarettes, about how cigarettes were good for you and how it was something that was energizing and made you feel a little bit more spiritual, made you feel more relaxed, or it was a great social activity, and you got to see every single movie star on camera and off camera, smoking the cigarettes. And if you wanted to go to a speakeasy, basically in that speakeasy, you're going to go find everyone who is, smoking, until the Surgeon General released an article saying like, this actually causes cancer, or this causes emphysema, or causes a wide variety of other diseases. Now it's something which is heavily regulated. At every moment throughout history, everyone thought that they got it exactly correct. And this is one of those moments in history where I think that there's something tragically wrong in terms of how much we are hypnotized by a lot of the easy access to simple pleasures. Internet is one of these things, but another one of these things could be the easy access to caffeine, or ease of access to sugar, or the ease of access to literally anything. You could go on your cell phone, you could touch it a couple places, and a pizza arrives at your front door. Okay, I don't think that the human body was evolved to have a pizza, but pizza is pretty damn good, and I promise you, I was thinking about pizza very frequently during this particular fast. But without digressing, I think ease of access to simple pleasures has accidentally found us in this weird halfway zone where we're halfway acting like the humans that we are and halfway acting like these addicted creatures. These are all results of what I've come to understand as our pleasure traps. Pleasure traps essentially being things that utilize some mechanisms that were intended to help us survive, thrive, reproduce, all those good things have been hijacked by product. Hijacked by products, again, like the internet, hijacked by products like foods, high sugar, high fat, high salt content foods, hijacked by simple pleasures like ease of access to pornography is a really dangerous one, hijacked by a wide variety of other products. All you have to really do is not look at the geese behind me, But what you have to do is go and examine the Fortune 200 companies. Any company that exists as some of the biggest and best companies in the world do produce a product by which its consumption in and of itself creates the cravings to further produce that product. Anyone that says, oh, I'm hungry today, I have a completely different understanding of what that means exactly. Usually, hungry right now means that I have a craving for sugar, whether that's a simple sugar like actual like glucose or fructose or something, or if it's a complex sugar like a piece of bread. That's what that is. When they're saying that they're hungry, they just have a craving for that carbohydrate. When people say that, I need to have coffee or caffeine or an energy drink in particular for energy, what that really means is that they have a craving for said substance, for said chemical, so that they can take that chemical and resolve the actual craving that they have. In the areas of neuroscience, typically how they describe these models is shifting from a liking to a wanting model. Basically, you have it for the first couple times, and it's great. It's a rush. It tastes amazing. You feel good. You feel energized. Everything's fantastic. But nothing comes for free. Essentially, you take what happened there, and if you repeat that stimulus over and over and over again, it shifts more towards a wanting phenomenon. The wanting phenomenon is what we describe as the craving. Is now we consume the substance not because we like it and we enjoy it. We consume the substance because if we don't, we will be miserable and we're going to go through mild or intense withdrawal pains. It's the same phenomenon for drug addicts that have to go through a withdrawal process, and they're usually much more intense because those drugs which are illegal essentially are far more addicting. It's much more difficult to get off of, and the withdrawal symptoms are accompanied by shaking, sweating, can't focus on anything, fatigue, confusion, because your body is desperately trying to get that hit that it has learned how to become used to and learned how to crave as opposed to actually like that thing. Just because we're dealing with things like food and caffeine or nicotine or with any sort of, gambling is another one of these things which I didn't discuss. Video games is another one of these things I didn't discuss. Anything else like that, when your brain is hooked on one of these things and then you cut it off cold turkey, essentially what happens is that your brain goes through mild withdrawal symptoms. And in these mild withdrawal symptoms, you essentially are going through a milder version of what these drug addicts would otherwise go through, that they actually need to go to a place so they can actually focus on getting better. Your body is in the middle of repairing itself in this process. So in this self-repair, this causes discomfort, and most people don't want to go through this discomfort. So biggest and first realization here, on top of that, we're just kind of living in an addicted society right now, is that if you want to go and take this path and start this fasting, don't start fasting things one at a time. Cut out everything at the same time. And this is a little bit counterintuitive because in a lot of instruction, they recommend that you take one thing out of your diet at the time, or you work on one item at a time and cut out this, and then you cut out this next thing and cut out this next thing, because it's too much for people to handle. But what you really need to consider is that it's quite uncomfortable for that time period. In fact, if you're cutting two things out at the same time, it's even more uncomfortable during that time period. But it doesn't, at some point it maxes out, where it doesn't get even more uncomfortable after that. And in my first 2 days where I was actually cutting out everything, I was cutting out food, I was cutting out caffeine, I was cutting out, I was actually changing the color on my cell phone. I changed it to black and white. So that it wasn't as stimulating, it wasn't as attractive to go look at. It took me a couple weeks before I actually cut out social media entirely right after that, because I was a little bit upset about how things were going at that time period. But essentially, I cut out everything at the same time. Now, the result of this was very interesting because I've cut out caffeine individually before. I've cut out food for like a 3-day fast before. I've cut out the internet for internet fast before. And in each of those times, it was very, very uncomfortable. But when I cut out all of them at the same time, it was actually quite easy. In fact, it didn't affect me nearly as much. Hell, when I cut out caffeine, I felt like half of a human for another 2 weeks. But things actually felt quite normal after just a couple of days. Yes, my brain was a little bit slowed down and choppy, but it was weird. It was almost as if it was better to cut out everything cold turkey right away, all at once, as opposed to doing it one thing at a time. Which is my first recommendation here, is that in this process, when you are cutting out a wide variety of things in this fasting process. Anything that you might go and cut out completely, cut out all at the same time. It's very counterintuitive, but it actually works, and it's much easier to do it that way in my personal experience. You go try it for yourself. I think it's actually the superior method. So a couple days after cutting these things out, I found my body repairing itself. I started feeling a little bit more normal. You would think that I would be hungry during this time period, and yes, I was hungry, of course, in this time period, because my body is realizing that, okay, it's not getting the calories that it otherwise would need right now. But what I discovered as my body started repairing itself, that my focus started going up, and my body's going into a process called ketosis during this time period, which is essentially the process of your body shifting from using glucose as its primary energy source to fats as its primary energy source by converting it into ketones. And in that process, if you've never gone through ketosis before, it is essentially, what you'll discover is that you have a stronger degree of focus while doing something like this. Ketones can pass through the blood-brain barrier, meaning it could be used as an effective source of energy for your body. If you even have one tiny bit of carbohydrate during this process, you get kicked out of ketosis, and now you're back to consuming carbohydrates and glucose. Carbohydrates will get broken down to glucose. But just by sticking with only fats, and you can look up different diets for how this happens. But if you stick to only fats, your body produces from those fats in your body, it turns it into ketones, and your body uses the ketones. Now, how does your body use energy when you're not putting anything inside of it? It uses the fat stores that are already sitting on your body to go convert into the energy that you're going to use for your brain and for the rest of your body. So if you've never done this before, what you'll realize is that your focus actually goes up, your energy is stable throughout the day, and you start asking questions like, why did I need coffee to find energy, or why did I need to find food, to feel satiated or to feel energized? Kind of an interesting phenomenon. But this got me thinking. I started formulating this thought and this hypothesis, which is one of these great insights that I feel is on par with many of the insights that others before me that have done a 40-day fast have shared, and which I'm sharing with you right now, is that you can actually completely rewrite your entire biology just by choosing what you allow to stimulate you. If you choose to be stimulated, say, by methamphetamine, then basically what that means is that you become a drug addict, and then you can see what happens to those people and how they change, and it completely changes their life. You can see like what, those old commercials, like this is your brain before drugs, this is your brain after drugs. But when you cut out these stimulants entirely, or actually when you add these stimulants in, it changes that person entirely. You could see what their face looks like, you can see what their skin tone looks like, what their eyes look like, how they behave, how they move, how they think, what they think about. It's really kind of gross. And my father used to work in a Metropolitan Armed Narcotics Squad, so he worked with busting a lot of these people, which is why I bring it up so much. And it's crazy to see what this drug can do to completely change someone. But we think about that just in terms of drugs. What it has to do is not so much drugs, but what it does to your dopamine circuits. And when we're dealing with things like sugar and like with internet content or games or anything like that, essentially what you're dealing with is the same problem, just on a smaller scale. So when you cut out that stimulant entirely, what you end up with is your biology begins to rewrite itself. It begins to rewrite itself into something entirely different. You could imagine a before and after picture. Like, what does someone look like after using, say, or after utilizing their phone 10 hours a day, and then before, what someone looks like and sounds like using their phone 10 hours a day. We don't have to look too far back in history to see what that was like, to see what the culture was like, to see what people were like. Back in the eras like the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and we can see what's happening now in the 2000s and the 2010s and 2020s. How people have changed now that you have people that are in their 20s today who have grew up on internet culture. So you have people that their entire lives have been glued to something which is effectively a drug. So what do you think happens when you cut these things out? Well, it turns out that the human brain and the human body is amazingly adaptable and will adapt to whatever sort of stimulants that you put into it and stimulants that you take away from it. So when you cut these things out, something has to go and take its place. And it turns out when you cut these things out completely, you actually not only rewrite the things you think about, but you rewrite your entire biology. You become more human than you were from before. For people especially that have problems with anxiety or with depression, or things like they're consistently emotionally unstable, or they have a poor time with self-control, cutting these things out entirely has the unique effect of changing your biology. So you can actually, I'm going to suggest here, and I'm going to hypothesize, and I think that I'm right on this, you can completely rewrite your entire biology by simply choosing what you allow to stimulate you. Consider this, for any of you that are students right now and you're studying, if you find it hard to sit down and actually go study for something, how much of your time off of work is spent on TikTok, or is spent on Facebook, or is spent on Instagram, or is spent on watching television? Think about that carefully. Think about the context by which you actually present the problem, because it's the context that actually makes the work difficult or makes the studies difficult. If you remove the context and then you just leave the studies, hell, there's some people that if you gave them a textbook, they would love you until the end of time, because you're just giving them all the entertainment they could possibly utilize for the foreseeable future, especially if you're thinking about a third world country, a prison, a penitentiary, any sort of retreat of some sort where it's just them and nature. If you give them just a book just to go read on, eventually they get bored enough that they say, you know what, that book is the most exciting thing in a 20 or 30 or 100 mile radius. So it's all about context here, which is why it's also important, why I'm emphasizing to cut out everything, not just food, because in this process you begin to discover who you are now that you're not distracted by all these little pleasure traps. If you change your entire environment, it's no different than if you were to change the soil that a seed gets planted in. Okay, and you could think about an apple seed. An apple seed is so small, it's tiny, but there's so much information, so much potential packed in that little seed. You put it in the ground and you water that seed, and it's in good soil, it begins to grow. It becomes an apple tree, and it relentlessly produces an endless amount of apples. You can think about, okay, well, how is a human like an apple seed? Sometimes you wake up and you feel like making apples, sometimes you don't. But the apple seed is relentless in its ability to grow and then to produce other apples. It just needs two things. One, it needs to be cared for, and two, it needs proper soil and nutrients. It's the same case here. You completely change the environment and your surroundings by changing what you allow to go and stimulate you, then you actually change your growth trajectory. You're stunting your growth right now by sticking around with these pleasure traps. If you remove them entirely and you surround yourself with the proper soil and nutrients, all you need are just patience, time, and attention, and focus on the things that actually matter. And the things that you find to be rather tough right now actually become quite easy over this time period. In fact, I'll give you a recommendation. Something I've been doing as a part to complement my meditation practice is what I'll do is I'll use a Pomodoro timer. A Pomodoro timer is named after, or rather, the timer is used for something called the Pomodoro Technique, where you work for 25 minutes and then you break for 5 minutes. Work for 25 minutes, break for 5 minutes, and then you go through about 10 of those in a given day. And then you will have accomplished a lot, and you'll have plenty of energy to stay focused to go do that, so you can get good grades, so you can perform well at work, so that you can deliver a good product with your businesses, whatever projects that you're working on right now. Instead of just using the Pomodoro timer, where you're going to work for 25 minutes and then break for 5 minutes, instead work for 25 minutes. In those 5 minutes, if you use that for anything of the pleasure traps I just mentioned right there, or any of the things like eating food, like because we're on a fast right now, or drinking coffee, or anything else, basically you're wasting those 5 minutes, which can be used properly for developing the context to actually make the 25 minutes the most exciting part of your day. You can actually flip the paradigm. There's nothing in biology that says that work is supposed to be hard and relaxation is not. You can actually enjoy and have fun with that particular work, the same way you can enjoy and have fun with a particular video game for hours and hours and hours and hours. And on the break is almost like you're forcing yourself to take a break. So this is how I did it. I worked for 25 minutes using this technique, and in those 5 minutes, I meditated. Okay, don't get too funny about the meditation stuff. Okay, simply just close your eyes and do nothing during those 5 minutes. At the very worst, you are simply allowing your brain to relax. Okay, even when you go to sleep, you think your brain is relaxing. It is, and it isn't at the same time. You know, your brains do a lot of stuff during sleeping. But when you sit down and just close your eyes for 5 minutes, minutes, what you're doing is you're allowing your brain to get a context which says that this is actually kind of boring right now. If it's kind of boring, then that's actually good news. You want it to be a little bit boring. So during those 5 minutes, you want to close your eyes and do nothing but meditate. At the worst case, you're resetting that context, and at the best case, you're allowing your brain to go into something called default mode network, where it can go reorganize itself and actually start healing. It can start healing and putting some of those areas into alignment. So work for 25 minutes, break for 5 minutes. That's the perfect way, and you'll feel the difference when you sit down and do your work during this time period. It is, this is how we become seeds with good soil and being cared for, is we want to take away anything that's poisoning the soil, which includes some of the items I was just talking about, and we're changing it. We're replacing it with good nutrients, which in this case is, during those 5 minutes, go and meditate. People cannot help but to go and be themselves, especially if they're in soil where they're feeding off of poisonous things. It's going to yield a poisonous plant. Okay, you want to yield off of good things that are actually going to yield the type of results that you want in your life. People can't help themselves but to go be themselves, and if you completely change their environment, they'll have that same compulsion to go and persist at being themselves and completely changing their character by changing what they allow to go stimulating them. Hence, again, completely change your whole life and your biology and your identity by changing what you allow to go and stimulate you. When you take away these things that would give you this cheap sense of pleasure, when you stop feeding on these things, something has to go and take its place. Talk biologically about how ketosis and ketones are taking that place when you start getting into that fat burning mode, but something else has to go and take that place. All right, what you'll discover in this process are a wide variety of things that go and take the place of that particular process. For example, something that took that place for me was the practice of truth-telling, speaking the truth. A lot of life around you is created the moment that you say something about it. If we call it a tree, if we call it a pond, if we call it a goose, whatever it is, the moment we give it a word, it almost comes to life. It comes to existence. I could see like a patch of grass over in front of me, which kind of has a yellowish color. Do we have a name for that? I'm not sure if we have a name for it, but the moment we did have a name, then it almost comes to life. Otherwise, it's just kind of in the background. It's still just kind of noise. So truth-telling means that you're speaking about the world and you're bringing the world into existence the way I just described in a way that is most truthful. By sharing your authentic feelings about people, by saying what you actually believe, by standing up for yourself, by actually fighting for yourself when you feel like your sense of self or sense of purpose has been denied you for one reason or another. Fighting for yourself means that you have a clear sense of where you want to go in life, the things that drive you forward. Some of you, going back to the apple seed example, some of you are apple trees, some of you are orange plants, some of you are pear trees, some of you are oak trees, some of you, perhaps maybe are tulip plants. We don't know until we start watering you, until we start letting you do these things. So I was feeling myself grow in this process now that I wasn't being hindered by these little distractions in this process. So what I found myself is being switched on. I found I had to feed on something else other than food or these little social media distractions or any other type of distractions. What was I feeding on instead? I was feeding on truth-telling, telling the truth. Even when it didn't work in my best interest, I was still telling the truth. I was acting truthfully, meaning that if I felt like I was supposed to go do something, I went and did it. Another big one, and one of those things is giving. Give something and create something for the benefit of someone else. What that means is that, for example, is in the process I wanted to have food. I had my girlfriend around, and I figured, I'm gonna make her food because there was something fulfilling in going to do that process. I was working with coaching clients at the time. In that process, I actually wanted to schedule even more calls with these people because I found it was actually the most truthful thing I could do in my action was just sit down and actually work with someone else to figure out how do we bring some things into alignment so that person doesn't face any suffering anymore. That's something I authentically enjoyed. In this process, I'm beginning to discover things that I actually enjoy, and this is how you start constructing your purpose and to figure out what your purpose, why you were put on this planet in the first place, and what you are supposed to do in the time that you have here. So that's a really, really important thing that I started discovering is the things that were giving me life, that were giving me energy, was was telling the truth, but also living the truth. You know, if you're acting in a way that is not congruent with the truth that is inside of you, then you're living a lie. It's kind of like an apple tree. It's trying to produce oranges. An apple tree is the most truthful plant out there because it's going to produce apples. There's nothing it can go do about it. It just does that. And you have to be doing the same thing. You have to be sitting down and saying, well, what do I authentically want to go and do right now? And to authentically want to go and do right now is the thing that you are compelled to do during this fasting process. There's nothing else that's more exciting than to actually live out that truth. And for me, it was to create something for the enjoyment of someone else. Okay, so when you think about, okay, so what are the things that you were put on this planet for? What sort of things can you think about? You would think about things like specialization. You should think about things like passions. You should think about things like what sort of actions you take already. You know, look at things that people already, the things by which other people already value your skill set for. If you don't have a skill set yet, there's a good opportunity to go and explore things. Something I discovered, I was just naturally more curious about my environment. I was actually walking a lot. I wasn't thinking like, oh, I have to conserve my energy. I actually walked a lot more than before I actually started this fast, trusting in the process that there's enough, you know, fat storage on my body to sustain myself, and I know that I'm going to be able to live off of those calories. There's some people that might think that, you know, this is kind of like a starvation process, and you actually can't go into starvation until there's no more fat on your body, wherever that might be. So that shouldn't be a hindrance at all. There's plenty of stories of people who have done long-term fasts for over a year simply because they had that much fat storage on their body. So there's that. What I discovered in this process is that if I'm going to be the proverbial apple seed and growing up, you know, being put in this new environment, I have to work on things one at a time. So what I would say is whatever thing that you're going to be doing with your alternative time, start working on these things one at a time and take the smallest step possible. Because it's with the smallest step you could take the next step, and it's with the smallest next step that you can take the step right afterwards. You know, I'm not a stranger to many challenges like this, like these 40-day fast or going on a 24-hour walk or doing a 24-hour coaching call. And there's little lessons that emerge in this process. And with something like a 24-hour walk, what the lesson that emerged from there is you can literally go as far as you want to as long as you take one easy step after the next. So what I would encourage you to do is in this process where maybe you're kind of turning up inside because you're not doing the usual things you would do for mental distraction or happiness, what you're going to do instead is start doing the smallest version of whatever you feel is in the direction of your purpose or your passion or the thing that you know is going to be your primary mode of making money in the future. So start doing the smallest thing. And what I would also encourage you to do is spend the whole day working on it. Okay, this is not always convenient for everyone because we have work, we have jobs, we have other obligations. But for something like on a weekend, spend the whole day just working on that one little thing. And you get to a point where there's a story about these Buddhist monks or these monks in a monastery where they have been literally without stimulation for so long that they could spend all day just like looking at the tiny movements of their finger and just appreciate those little movements. You would think that sounds ridiculous. Well, how could it possibly be the case? How could that possibly be the case? You're taking your baseline threshold of what you accept as being like stimulating and enjoying, and when you take it away, that baseline goes down. So you start to begin to enjoy very, very subtle things like those little movements. You begin to enjoy subtle things like literally just taking a deep breath and enjoying like the fresh air around you. Or if it's dirty air, being able to appreciate and enjoy the dirty air around you, be able to look around and all the colors in the environment, they stick out just a little bit more. Even if it's a uniform color, you start to appreciate some of those little details. So what I would say is as you're working on things and you're living in your own truth, which is exactly what your body was designed, what you feel is going to be congruent with the role of why you're on this planet, start doing a really small action in that direction and then just start repeating it and spend a whole day working on it. I'll give you a hint here, is that usually the problem that you're most troubled by is usually going to be the thing that you end up obsessing over, and thus the thing that is going to be the motif of your life purpose. And there's plenty of problems that I'm really troubled about, but I could think that one thing I'm very, very troubled about is why can't like an average human being go out and start a conversation with someone else these days? That seems to be really tough, especially for someone who has worked hard, who is someone who's very ambitious, someone who is very responsible, why is it so difficult for that person to go outside and make friends? We have a huge problem in terms of social isolation these days. Again, I think it's in large part by that void being filled in by social media and access to the internet. But take something, start the smallest version of it and just repeat it over and over and over again. Do 1,000 reps of that thing. Spend the whole day working on it to a point where you actually start to appreciate the tiny little nuances of those things. And you actually can appreciate the tiny little nuances of something that could be very valuable to you in the future, because you're not, the context of your dopamine and your threshold of what you consider to be enjoyable is now lowered to a level of where you could just simply enjoy like a fresh breath of air, and now you can start enjoying the little nuances of that practice. If you're thinking about doing law school in the future, start by reading. Start by reading anything. Start reading a law text. Start by thinking about argumentation, how arguments are put together. If you're thinking about going to medical school in the future, start thinking about how does healing happen? Like, what is that process? Let's think about biology. Let's start studying things like biology. When you don't have the distractions that we have right now, you can actually take the time to zoom in onto what matters most to you, and your natural biology will like it. It's not something where you have to fight against your natural biology to say, no, I got to go back and go see what my friends are doing right now, or I have to go and play this video game, or I have to do something else. No, you can authentically and actually enjoy the process, which is in most alignment with your purpose. And that's a really cool place to be in, because usually we're in a battle against our biology to actually focus on the things that matter. Actually, what we're doing is we're setting up the context where it's actually the most enjoyable thing that we can go do. Okay, so that's on the first point in terms of you can change your entire life by changing what you allow to stimulate you. And before I go on this, I'll just kind of give you a sense of like what that withdrawal process kind of looked like for me. So typically what happens is that you have the cravings come back, and then there's a little bit of a headache, and then it drops a little bit, and then the cravings are most intense, and then right before, in fact, right after the cravings are most intense, they disappear entirely. They completely go away. And that was the experience I had with caffeine in particular, because I've religiously been drinking coffee every single day, going back to high school, going back to late high school, which is, has to be like, some 12 or 14 years now. Yeah, it's got to be about 15 years. So for about 15 years, I've been pretty much drinking coffee every single day, with an exception for maybe a couple days or a couple weeks, or if I'm doing a challenge just to get rid of caffeine. But I've been drinking coffee for quite some time. But sometime in about 1 to 2 weeks in, I just didn't think about coffee anymore, which is really, really interesting, because it used to be something that was a major focus of me. And even today, I'm driving around and I'm thinking about like, hey, I could have coffee again. Like, this is great. But I'm looking at it, I'm just thinking like, why would I want to do that? It's like, it doesn't compel me anymore, which is so fascinating, because when you think about it, it's like us versus the substance and having self-control over ourselves. But in this full deprivation process, where I just haven't touched this stuff, it's almost more of an inconvenience to go get it than it is a convenience to get it. Because guess what? My energy's been pretty damn stable for the past 40 days now. Yes, but there have been moments where I've been thinking like, man, I could really use like a slice of pizza right now, or a cheeseburger or something. But being away from the substance entirely, I don't feel compelled to go back to it anymore. My source of energy is no longer associated with a substance like that. It's now associated with what I'm doing with myself, or rather, I'm now hooked onto my purpose of little things like I just mentioned. Why is it so difficult for someone who is well accomplished to just be social, to go start a conversation with someone, or to develop a friendship? That's a very, very tough problem that a lot of people are facing these days. Another big one is, why can't we get ourselves to do the things that we're supposed to go and do? If we sit down and we set out to go do something, and then we go change our minds halfway through, why did we set out for it in the first place? Something happened in there, and that's a really big issue. But now I'm more connected to that than to other of these artificial sources of energy. So, but for anyone that's going through this process and is worried about those cravings, worried about those withdrawals, usually it peaks at some point, and then it goes away completely, and you never think about it ever again. You'll think about it to an extent, and you'll see it or mention it, but it doesn't hold the same place in your mind and body anymore, now that you've just gone away from it completely. So that's that. So I believe that you can actually change your entire biology by choosing what you allow to stimulate you. And I also believe that you actually can change your entire psychology, your entire mind, by changing the story that you tell yourself. This is not such an intuitive idea here, but now that we've actually changed the actual the nutrients of the soil around us, we're changing how we're able to allow our environment to allow us to grow. Now we're asking ourselves, well, what about all those weird thoughts in my head about what's happening in the meantime? Well, you have to simply change the story, and this is not so much a science as it is an art. It is the art of what story you tell yourself, how you explain the world to yourself, so that you can actually go live your purpose, go live in a way that's most congruent with what you're looking for. Really, really tough thing to do. I'll give you an example. If you're going through some adversity or some painful situation, is that adverse situation happening to you, or is that something that's happening for you? It could be easily both, depending on what story that you're telling yourself. If it's happening to you, it's very easy to take that victim role, that victim mindset, where you're essentially saying, oh, woe is me, how is it that I can actually go and do this and live my life in this way, where I'm living in this horrible situation where there's nothing that anyone can go do to save me. You can also think about it as, this is training. This is training for me so that when I'm presented with a situation that's more important in the future, I can handle myself with greater ease, with more grace, and with as a stronger person. It's no different than going to the gym. You go to the gym to lift the heavy weights, not the light weights. If you go to the gym to lift the light weights, you're just wasting your time. If you go to the gym to lift the heavy weights, yeah, it hurts, yeah, it tears up your muscle, but when it heals the muscle, it grows back stronger than before. It doesn't grow back weaker. It doesn't stay the same. It grows back stronger, and that's the whole intention. There's many tough things that happen to us throughout life, and we see it as like, oh, this is a horrible thing. I wish it never happened. Well, let's think about it this way. In what case, suppose you needed to have that situation happen in your life. You needed to have a rough situation where something happened to your parents, something happened to your friends, something happened to you. You failed majorly at an exam. You lost a business relationship. Your dog drowned somewhere, or you lost your pet fish. For anything to happen, you're thinking how could this thing happen? Well, maybe you needed to have that training in order to be prepared for something larger in the context of the future. Both stories are correct. Both of them are true. Both of them are neutral. But which one do you go and tell yourself? If you're going to start going telling your story where these things are happening to you, it's easy to take the mindset of it's the world against me, as opposed to the alternative, which is you smile with the world and the world smiles back. If you introduce yourself with an energy to the world, where you get to say, you know what, this is actually a challenge. No, this is actually a lesson. This is something important I'm supposed to learn right now for some future, case. This is for future me right now. What am I supposed to go do with this? I don't know yet, but I'm going to be damn ready for it. To start seeing the world in those lenses is much more productive, at least for me. It might be more productive for you to see it in the alternative lens, but in any case, you can actually change your whole mind in psychology by changing the story that you tell yourself. Changing the story that you tell yourself is very, very useful in this process. I'm thinking I have these hunger pains, this sucks, but I'm also thinking no, this is actually training my self-control. This is actually training my focus. I'm actually losing a good amount of weight. My cholesterol is finally lowered for the first time ever. In fact, I should take a quick aside and talk about blood work. Somewhere in the middle, you should definitely get your blood taken, your blood checked, just to see where your electrolytes are at, and to check where your vitamins are at. The most dangerous part of doing this process, because I'm not going to say it's not exactly safe, which is why it's so recommended against, is the refeeding process. The refeeding process is essentially where you sit down and you have your first bite of meal. What happens? So if your body goes into experiences an insulin spike, which typically happens when you have lots of carbohydrates, it starts trying to take from electrolytes that are not there. And when that happens, that's when the probability of actual heart failure will happen, and it can be quite dangerous. And some people end up in the hospital from doing something like this. So afterwards, a lot of people have recommended to be drinking only bone broth in the days coming after. But whatever it is you go do, again, check with your doctor, make sure it's safe. Make sure you're doing things the right way. My doctor is recommending to start with small pieces of food, particularly protein, and then work my way up. I played around with it. I discovered that actually my body's responding to it quite well. So I was a little bit more ambitious, but definitely something I would definitely not recommend. Definitely something I wouldn't recommend to anyone to go quickly back onto food in the aftermath. But in any case, definitely changing the way that you tell the story to yourself about what's happening around you, and you can actually change how you experience the world. In fact, that is how humans experience the world. Basically, we have this function where we perceive the world that's around us, with our sensations, what happens, what we feel on our skin, with what we see with our eyes, with what we taste, with what we smell. We take in all this information, okay? And then what do we do with that information? Well, essentially, we go and tell ourselves a story afterwards. We say, okay, this was this way because of this reason right here. Oh, I felt this way because, it's getting cold because it's night out. Or I could say, oh, I'm hungry because I didn't have food. Or I could say, oh, I'm thirsty because I didn't have water. And this is how we construct our world, how we construct ourselves, and how we understand ourselves. So, and then that goes back into perception. So when we tell ourselves that story, then we go and we feel a certain way again. And then we go tell ourselves a story, and then we go feel a certain way. So it's this constant feedback loop of feelings coming through perception into interpretations, how we handle it through thinking. So that goes in a circle over and over and over and over again. And you can think about, well, what happens if that circle goes around and around enough times? Well, that's what we call an identity. And your identity about who you are is represented by how many times in a row that circle has went over and over and over, which is why some people who are a little bit older have a more firm identity because that thought loop has happened over and over and over again, whereas people that are a bit younger, it hasn't happened so much and they're still open-minded to telling themselves a different story. It's a great thing you could do if you have children, is literally just go to your child and literally tell them about themselves, tell them what you think of them, and to go tell them how to go interpret the world in a way that you feel would be best in terms of parenting. So, big thing is that you want to figure out what story you need to go tell yourself to go interpret what your life is and what your life is going to be in the near future, and in the long-term future for that matter as well, because it's going to be through this consistency of keeping up with this habit. You'll be able to create that new identity by keeping that story consistent over and over and over again. This might be a little bit of a difficult thought to go and digest, but if you think about the world that you see out there, it's not really the world that you see. It's really the world as you perceive it. And when you look out in the world and you see green, you have no idea if that's grass, tree. You have no idea if that's actually green. Okay, what you're seeing is a reflection of light that's coming in, it's going into your eyeball, that goes to the back of your head, it flips the image around, and then we essentially look at it, and we've all collectively agreed that that is green. So there's many different levels that are all having to do with interpretation. We can all say, well, in our language it's green, but in Spanish it's verde, or it's a different word in a different language. But I want to get really, really clear on this, is that when we see it, what we see is how that light hits us, which begs the question, is it really green? It's like, well, we could say that it's green, and we feel and we know and we trust it's green. If you ask any human on the planet, they would also agree and see that that's indeed the same color. But what's important to know is that the world is halfway what is out there, and it's halfway what is in here. Which means that if you completely change the story, that you actually completely change the whole world around you. If you change your biology in the way I was just describing, by changing what you allow to stimulate you, you completely change who you are. If you completely change who you are, you actually completely change the world around you. If you change the story that you actually tell yourself, then you can completely change how you go and reinterpret the world. Something doesn't need to invoke anxiety or frustration or depression or anything else if you're telling yourself a story, or maybe you're seeing that it's not happening to you, it's happening for you. Or maybe an alternative story with that regard is you could say, perhaps this is not frustrating at all. This is here to go train my patience. This is something that's here to, again, help you instead of something that's there to hurt you. So by changing those stories, you start to look at the world with a different lens. And when you look at the world with a different lens, again, if perception is halfway what the world is out there and halfway of what is happening right here, the world literally changes before your eyes if you're able to go do these couple of things. In this process, what you'll discover is that there's going to be a lot of messages that come to you. And these messages, they come in the form of ideas, of thoughts. When there's no food in your body and you go to sleep, and then your body is just simply processing. It's literally just processing right now, and it's not spending any time digesting. You'll discover little messages like some of the ones I've just mentioned to you today. These are very, very important messages, and I think this is how information like that is conveyed to other people in this process, and the importance of truly a 40 days of no eating, and including with that, it's not just not eating, but also not consuming anything else except for the things which is most in alignment with your future purpose and with your role on this planet, and understanding how you fit together with just the nature of things. So when these messages come up, listen to them, write them down. It's going to be very difficult to remember these later on. The same way I've been writing them down, I would encourage you, when these messages come up, to go and write them down. They're instructions. They're giving you instructions for how to go conduct your life in the short term and in the long-term future. They're telling you about you, now that you could say, okay, with nothing inside of my body, nothing inside of my mind, what is left? What is left about me, and what is left about my spirit and about human nature in and of itself. You can learn a lot of information during this time period, so I would encourage you to be open to these messages. Another reason why I would again emphasize to have like a practice, a question, something that you emphasize, so you could feed upon something else other than just food or any of these little pleasure traps that I've already mentioned. And the last item I would mention, which is really, I think, that is the most important item that I feel sums up these couple points that I've learned personally from this process, is to live impeccably. Okay, live impeccably does not mean that you're perfect by the sense of what you think perfection is, meaning that you wake up at 5 in the morning every day, work every minute of the day, you have perfect relationships, you have perfect work, you have a perfect diet, and then you go to sleep at the end of the day. I don't mean that type of perfection. Impeccably could be confused with living perfectly. What I mean by living impeccably means that you are respecting the rules of reality, the natural order of things, the framework of how the world is put together, and you're living as best you can possibly live within that framework. If you go out and you say, like, look, my energy levels are just shot today, and I did as much work as I possibly could, and I only got like 3 or 4 hours in. Okay, that's fine. That's living impeccably, because you did the best given the conditions that you had. Now you could say, okay, well, how do I need to go change my environment and then change the thoughts in my head and do better tomorrow? It's almost in the nature of things to go through some of these cycles where you have really, really good days and then you have bad days. It's in denial of reality to expect every day to be even better than the last. There's always going to be up days and there's always going to be down days, but you definitely want to have a longer term trajectory of an upward trend while you're going through these cycles. But what I would encourage for you with this process, while taking on this heavy load, this heavy burden of taking on this, what you've been called to do, which is this longer fast, this 40-day fast, is what I would encourage you to do is to go and live impeccably, in most alignment with some of your purpose, with some of the major insights you're supposed to learn in this process, and allow your body to go through its natural healing process until you can get to a place where you too can walk around feeling with excellent self-control, excellent focus. It's the information age. It's one of the most unprecedented times in our history, where we've been inundated with the amount of information that our brains just do not know how to handle. And as a result of that, it's created all sorts of anxiety problems, all sorts of confusion problems, and everyone tells themselves the story that it's something that's wrong with them, as opposed to the story of, I'm having a human moment in a very inhuman time, and I'm doing my best to go and keep up. I wish the best for you. Good luck on this process, and let me know how everything went.